So thanks for joining us for another episode of the Burma Railway series. Now, I have to say up front that this is not the happy episode. That will be the next one when we take a ride on the train. There are parts of this episode that some of you, maybe all of you, will find quite disturbing. So I have to issue the usual disclaimer that viewer discretion is advised. So right now we're at Ban Pong Station, which is just down the line from Nong Pla Dock, which we visited in episode 2. And this is part of the original line, which was built in 1903 and goes all the way down the Malaysian peninsula. If I remember correctly, it goes across the causeway right into Singapore. So just across the other side of the line there, over at the back there were two camps. One for the Japanese and the prisoners of war, and the other one for the Romusha. That's a Japanese word which should have meant paid indentured laborers, but in fact meant unpaid slaves. There were thousands arriving here every day, both here and at Nong Pla Dock round the corner there. They'd been crammed into cattle trucks or freight cars for several days to reach this point. And they were crammed in so tightly it wasn't even possible to sit down, let alone lie down. And of course the conditions were unbearable because they were steel rail cars, which during the day were blisteringly hot and at night were freezing cold. And the trains only stopped once a day, basically to allow people to get off and to buy food at exorbitant prices and to, how shall we say, answer the calls of nature. But unfortunately, nature doesn't really work like that, and stopping once a day wasn't really sufficient. So it's hard to imagine the conditions of the interior of the rail cars when they arrived here. Now, most of the Romusha, or the laborers, thought they were coming to a better life. So you can imagine how they felt when they arrived here to find there was absolutely nothing, no camps, nothing. And they brought with them, because they thought they were coming to paid work, they brought with them wives and children and belongings. Most of the belongings were just jettisoned along the way because they realized they weren't going to have any use for them. But as soon as they arrived here, they were split into groups of about 30 and sent off into the jungle. And just hacked their way from here right up to the Burmese border, which is probably 350 kilometers away. So of course, when they arrived here, they very quickly realized that life was about to get worse, much worse. The lucky ones were sent by truck to work on the sections of the railroad between here and Kanchanaburi. But the others were marched through the jungle, and most of that was done at night, partly due to the reduced heat, but also in the hope that the wildlife would be fast asleep. And you have to remember that there would be deadly snakes, scorpions, and centipedes, not to mention tigers, leopards, and wild elephants. And of course, not all of them arrived. It was impossible for some of them to keep up. Some of them contracted diseases and were just left by the wayside. Either that or the Japanese decided they were no use, and so they just killed them. Now, there were many camps all along the line of the planned railroad, especially where major works had to be undertaken. It's a little known fact that there were two bridges here. There was a fork in the line just beyond the WWII station over there, and that led to a wooden trestle bridge that came across the river roughly where I'm standing now. And that rejoined the line somewhere down there beyond the bridge. And it was very useful while the steel bridge was being constructed, except that it became a major target for bombers, and it was being wood, it was easy to destroy, so it was constantly being rebuilt. This photo shows both bridges, and it's easy to see the bomb craters. Here you can see the two bridges, plus the large prisoners of war camps that were alongside the river over there. If you look at today's Google map photo, then you can see that the bridge has disappeared, as have the prisoner of war camps. And of course, up at Hellfire Pass, there were several prisoners of war camps. This photo shows Konyu 1, Konyu 3, which was for the prisoners of war and the Japanese, plus the Malay camp for the Romusha. And up at Songkaria near the border, there were several camps because that was one of the most difficult bridges to build. This is a photo of 3 Australian soldiers who are all under 25 years old, and they're all deemed fit to work. And if you didn't work, you died, because the Japanese considered that anyone not fit to work was not worth feeding. And I'm going to quote here, as one Australian soldier reported, to call the place a camp was a complete misnomer, as it merely consisted of 2 parallel series of huts. None of the huts was yet roofed, and the prisoners were crowded 10 men to a bay, measuring 3 by 3.5 meters, and they were drenched by constant rain or flooding from below. Kitchen facilities were nil. Water was restricted to a very small stream. The so-called hospital was no different. And actually, I'm going to stop here because his description of the hospital is so horrendous that once you've built a mental image of the place, you'll never get rid of it. But it involves overflowing excrement and millions of maggots and much worse. And that was the hospital. As we've seen, conditions alone were deadly, but on top of that, prisoners received deliberate punishment. So I thought it appropriate to finish the story alongside the Guan Yin statue, the goddess of mercy, which is very close to the famous bridge. Some of these stories have been so brutal that I felt it symbolic to finish the story here. This place is dedicated to compassion, and compassion is something that was desperately missing from this whole story. Some of the cruel acts meted out by the Japanese captors defied both logic and decency. One favorite punishment was to force a prisoner of war to stand the whole day holding a huge rock above his head. And if he either fainted or he dropped the rock, then he was in for a severe beating. And to try to force the prisoners to drop the rock, the Japanese stood behind them with a vertical bamboo whip, hitting them directly between the shoulder blades. Prisoners deemed to have committed a more serious act, like stealing a piece of fish, were confined to a bamboo cage just 1.2 meters by 1.2 meters and 1.5 meters high. And they were forced to stand in this cage from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., despite the fact it was almost impossible to stand when it was only 1.5 meters high. Anyone found not standing was dragged out, given a severe beating, and then thrown back in. And sometimes they would be in this cage for as long as 2 weeks. They were generally known as hell cages. But the ultimate punishment was to be taken to a place where there was a bamboo grove, and they would be forced to cut the bamboo at ground level. Then they were stripped naked and staked to the ground on top of the cut bamboo area. Now, if they were lucky, and I mean that sincerely, if they were lucky, they would die quite quickly due to dehydration or heat stroke. But if they were not lucky, then bamboo grows incredibly quickly, and they would be killed within 2 or 3 days by the new bamboo shoots growing up through their bodies. I really can't think of a more painful way to die. And how, you might be wondering, were the Japanese allowed to commit such horrendous acts? Well, although they were signatories to the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, they never actually ratified it, which means the Japanese government didn't pass a domestic act making the acts illegal. And as far as I can tell, they still haven't signed it. Anyways, I felt it important to document the things that happened here in Thailand before we move on. The next episode will be more cheerful because we'll take a ride on the train, so please join us for that.